Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the recently appointed Vice Chair of the Conservative Party, Ben Bradley MP, has apologised for suggesting people on benefits should be given vasectomies. He wrote that in a blog in 2012. But in an age when everything is recorded online, should we learn to be more forgiving of past mistakes? Here's what Mr Bradley said. Sorry, but how many children you have is a choice. If you can't afford them, stop having them. Vasectomies are free. Families who have never worked a day in their lives, having 4 or 5 kids, and the rest of us having 1 or 2, means it's not long before we're drowning in a vast sea of unemployed wasters that we pay to keep. Last week, Toby Young stepped down from his role at the Office for Students over tweets like this one in 2009, referring to American reality show host Padma Lakshma, saying, "Do Padma's breasts look bigger than normal?" I think they do. He said a lot worse than that. And returning to work today is the Labour MP Jared O'Mara. In 2004, he wrote, "Girls allowed, I advise you to sack Sarah and the remaining 4 members, come have an orgy with me." He resigned from the Commons Women's and Equalities Committee after it was made public. Joining me now to discuss this, our philosopher, Dr Piers Ben, and Aaron Bastani, co-founder of the left-wing website Novara Media. Hello to you both. Thank you for joining us. Doctor, to you first of all, what shall we do?
Well, I think I haven't much to say about the specific cases you mentioned, but I think there's a wider general point, which is about whether we should take particularly seriously things that people have said a long time ago that may not reflect their present views, and whether there may be many other good things about what that person has done that might compensate for the bad record. I think the problem is that although sometimes we should take into account stupid things people have said, and that should be relevant to whether they should be employed in a public office and so on. I mean, who among us could really, bear scrutiny of everything we might have said 20 or 30 years ago in jest or not having grown up and so on? So I think it leads to a culture where people have to think too literally and too over-reflectively about the exact meaning of their words. I mean, clearly some people say stupid things and obnoxious things, but there's a wider context to take into account.
Aaron?
Yeah, I think in regards to Twitter in particular, there's this new personal archive which can be up for 10 years in the case of Toby Young. I think, like you said, the tweets were 8 years ago. And that's a new phenomenon. And yes, we do have to think quite sensitively about this because it's a new social issue. The idea that thousands of ideas that you've had, fundamentally you're a different person, are in a permanent archive. But Toby Young was also a journalist. You know, he wrote about premeditated assault on a lesbian woman in a New York bar. He wrote about, as a journalist, he actually said, this is why I've been banned from the Groucho Club, dealing cocaine to artists. So Toby Young, as a journalist, was writing those things for public consumption, so I think he really should be scrutinised on the basis of being a journalist, owning up to criminal activity, fundamentally. In the case of Jared O'Mara and Ben Bradley, I agree it's different. They were younger people. I'm sure they don't believe those things anymore, or at least I hope not. Nevertheless, they didn't come forward and submit that information when they were selected for both the Labour and the Conservative parties, which for me is deeply concerning. And the inference has to be that they still believe these things. Otherwise, why would they seek to hide it while seeking selection?
Yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable point, though, isn't it, Doctor? You know, just because they said, oh, that was a long time ago, doesn't mean that they, and they might say they don't believe it anymore, but then they would say that, wouldn't they?
They would say that, wouldn't they? But it also could be true. I mean, we all regret things we've said. We all say things in a certain context when, on reflection, we wouldn't endorse the wider picture. I think the point I really want to make is a wider one about the role of social media and Twitter outrage, because I think it's having a very damaging effect on public discourse. What you find is that people are... Well, for example, people on Twitter, or Twitter mobs as they're called, will react with outrage at a particular phrase somebody's used, and they'll often say, this person says one thing, but of course we all know he or she is really saying something else. And that's often the problem of malicious or willful or just negligent misinterpretation. It may be that the person who said this thing really meant to say something else, that there was some other hidden agenda, but equally it may not be. And the result is, ironically, that with all the fury on Twitter and all the intolerance, you get a kind of dumbing down and a sort of timidification, if there's such a word, of public discourse. Politicians are extremely anxious that they won't be retweeted and so on, so they end up saying things which are incredibly bland and facile and often sentimental, when there are sometimes real social issues that need to be discussed and get shut down by this sort of outrage.
Aaron?
Yeah, I don't really agree with that. I mean, we just had a general election last year, which was the most politically polarised in a generation. I think the electorate was very well informed, whichever way they voted. Youth turnout was massively up. Voter turnout amongst poorer, low-income voters was up. So I don't agree with that. The Scottish independence referendum in 2014, I think the electorate was very well informed. Again, high turnout. Brexit, some people don't like to say it. I think actually people generally were pretty well informed. Again, very high turnout. More people voted in that than any general election. So I don't think there's a correlation there if we're looking at this as social scientists, for instance, of a dumbing down and use of social media. Quite the opposite. I talk to young people about policy issues. Actually, they're very, very aware of what's going on. On the one hand, I do agree that there is this phenomenon of Twitter mobs. Often it's not particularly productive. I've been subject to Twitter mobs myself. But I do also think that Ben Bradley's comments are in a broader context of the Tories. We see it with Toby Young. I think having something of an issue towards, let's call it, eugenics. I mean, they do sort of tap into century-old tropes, and I don't think they believe these things. They're tropes about the poor being a drain on the rest of us, being a parasite. And I don't think he thinks that they should be, have vasectomies or, be castrated. But it is a worry that MP thinks about working people in such a way.
Do we not, Doctor, have to man up, person up a bit? And, it is only Twitter. It is only social media. It's not like you've got a mob with pitchforks at your door. You can just switch it off.
Well, you can do, but I think some people, especially those in public life, are genuinely afraid of how they'll be mobbed or retweeted and interpreted on Twitter. In a way, I mean, social media is froth.
My point is that you don't have to be, and if you can't cope with it, Doctor, then you should step away. I like Aaron, have been in a position where, I have suffered from Twitter mobs. Doesn't bother me a jot.
No, I agree entirely with that. I think people should try to learn to cope. It can be difficult. That wasn't actually my point. I mean, to talk about what's just been said, I don't deny that a great deal of commentary on Facebook and Twitter and so on are well informed. And I wasn't really talking about elections and so on. What you find, though, is that when somebody says something which touches a raw nerve, like what was said about those who are unemployed, and the inference being they want to be unemployed. There are lots of social issues that need to be discussed that somehow get shut down by words like eugenics. This person must be a eugenicist. I'm not saying that's what. Yeah, well, indeed, I'm not saying you're saying those things, but people jump on these words and say, we can't have this, or we can't have a discussion of the wider issues, so therefore let's shut down discussion of really important social issues. No, I don't agree with what the MP said and so on. It's not really the point. It's the wider issue. What I meant was the dumbing down of what certain politicians and commentators are saying because of how they're afraid their words will be taken. And I think that's very bad for our current political discourse.
Can I just say one thing? I think it's the complete opposite problem with Toby Young. Toby Young courted social media to build a personal brand on controversy and outrage. And actually, he lived by the sword and he died by the sword.
Sure.
Toby Young went to a conference at UCL last year. I'm a UCL alumnus. I was very proud of it until I heard about this. Actually discussing eugenics, discussing a range of things, including having sexual intercourse with underage children.
He did deal with that, though, on social media, and he said why he'd gone and what he didn't realise what was going to be discussed at the time, etc.
But it was a eugenics conference.
He's not here to defend himself, so I'm just lobbing that in. Go on.
Of course, but it was a conference which was touching on issues surrounding eugenics. Again, we're not trying to sensationalise the issue. That's precisely what it was. And this was a man who's involved in free schools. He was going to have a major role to play in the oversight, the sort of supervision of this new regulator we're going to have in higher education. So, yes, eugenics is absolutely the right word to use, I think, because that's the conference that he went to.
Well, a lot depends on what you mean by eugenics. They were
calling themselves eugenicists.
OK, let's narrow ourselves down to this too much, shall we? Let's stay with the wider point, should we, about social media and the way that we are using social media, on whether or not we should be, as that term, I don't know whether I like it or not, snowflakes about it, or whether we have to accept that, lots of people want to be citizen journalists now, and with that comes some responsibility, even if it comes to bite you on your bottom 12 years later, Doctor.
Yeah, I think that people on social media are there for various reasons. We all know about the obvious trolls, people who say annoying things, who are not in any way interested in having rational dialogue. I think that that's very unpleasant. I think that some people are very upset by it. People have different reactions, and it's wrong to try to upset people. What I think happens, though, is that people sometimes seize on certain words, or they seize on certain assumptions about what the person speaking on social media must really be saying. And then people say, oh, they must be saying this, we can't discuss this, and therefore let's not discuss whatever deep and important and wide social issues that need to be discussed. I mean, social media is a very mixed blessing. It's certainly very good in the sense that you can share interesting articles, interesting thoughts, it gets information around, but it also simplifies things, it turns things into a Manichaean kind of black and white worldview for many people, where there's not enough time to develop your thoughts, to develop nuances, and actually to apologise for what you said, or to change your mind, or to say, well, actually, I see your point, I didn't quite mean that, what I meant was this. Social media is a very blunt tool for that, and that's why you get this horrible bifurcation of reaction.
OK, I suppose, Aaron, it would help if people sort of reread their tweets and potentially apologise before they were exposed by the newspapers?
Yes, it could well be, but at the same time, people need to be, I don't know whether forgiving is the right word, but certainly tolerant, or have a nuanced attitude to people who speak when they, using the wrong words, not quite meaning what they appear to have said. I mean, sometimes they do mean those things. I'm not trying to whitewash it, but sometimes they don't. And to have a discussion, say, OK, what might you have meant by this? Let's see what might be said on this side. Let's see how that might be counter-argued. Okay. And let's not lose sight of the wider important issue underneath it. OK, that question was for you, Aaron, so please answer it.
Well, I mean, we're now having two conversations, and they're both really valuable. One is the place of social media in society and Twitter mobs, and I agree with much of what you just said. This is a very odd technology, Hundreds of millions of people use Twitter, and when I go to bed at night, my phone is next to my bed, and any one of those hundreds of millions of people
can say... Don't do that! There'd be dragons there!
It's on airplane, don't worry. But any one of them can say what they want to me, right, hypothetically, which is incredible when you think about it. But then the separate conversation about the kinds of standards we want from people in public life, they should be of the highest standards. I think is a really profound one. And yes, we're going to have a conversation about people's archive data on things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. But I do think we should have the highest standards. And if somebody can make a compelling, authentic apology about it, which I don't think Ben Bradley's done, frankly, I don't think Jared Amara did either, then I think, of course, they should still be able to be in public office. But otherwise, I think absolutely, yes, these things should count against them. OK. It's good to talk to both of you. Thankfully, at the end of this interview, there's happiness in your eyes. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.